Greetings to one and all. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Matthew Melvin-Koushki. Thanks for being with us today, Matt.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Matt is an associate professor of Islamic history at the University of South Carolina. Matt specializes in early modern Islamicate intellectual and imperial history with an eye especially toward theory and practice of occult sciences in Timurid and Safavid Iran. Today, we're going to be starting out by taking a very broad approach to understanding what Pythagoreanism even is, and then we're going to zoom in on some particulars, especially as Pythagoreanism relates to one of your favorite figures, Ibn Turka, and the New Brethren of Purity.
Mm-hmm.
So, to kick off our discussion, Matt, I'd like to ask you, how do we go from the mysterious figure of Pythagoras living on Crotona in the 6th century BC to Pythagoreanism as a kind of mathematical cult, to Neopythagoreanism as a sort of hippie lifestyle in late antiquity, to the kind of Prisca Theologia narratives we get justifying Catholicism in the Latin West with Marsilio Ficino, and in parallel, Shiite Islam in the Islamicate East with men like Ibn Turka and the New Brethren of Purity?
Yeah, absolutely. The main thing that's been militating against such a large-scale narrative of the large-scale history of Pythagoreanism into Neo-Pythagoreanism, into many, many subsequent forms of what we might conveniently call Neo-Pythagoreanism, although, of course, listeners of the Schwepp podcast, the Seeker History of Western Esotericism podcast, has had a number of episodes on this topic in the Hellenistic period, and Earl Fontenelle, the host, really does make a case for not talking about Pythagoreanism at all, or Neo-Pythagoreanism at all, as a coherent thing. That said, at least in my early modern Persianate context, it's precisely the inchoateness and the slim textual base for Pythagoreanism in antiquity that allows even more creativity, right, around certain themes that we know from antiquity and late antiquity. The world as a mathematical text, number, numerology, arithmology being quite important. But yeah, seeing the world as a geometrical, mathematical construct in the first place. Number as the way to get to the supernal realities, number as a main concern of metaphysics as well as physics. That comes roaring back in a big way in the early modern context, not so much the medieval Arabic context. The reception of Hellenistic, late antique Pythagoreanism or Neo-Pythagoreanism, mainly through the Golden Verses, Plotinus, Iamblichus, and so on, was mixed. It was quite mixed. You have some proponents, you have some opponents. Mainly, as Anna Izdebska has shown at the University of Warsaw, essentially, it's a split between Aristotle. Folks who tend more toward Aristotle tend away from Pythagoras as a figure of any importance in the history of philosophy, even though he might have invented the term philosophy. He recedes in importance. He pales in importance next to Aristotle. For those who are more on, the Platonic, Neoplatonic side, obviously Pythagoras is going to be more important, and even celebrated by folks like the Ikhwan as-Safa, the Brethren of Purity in 10th century Abbasid Iraq. But they were anonymous. They were big fans of Pythagoras, but they were anonymous. Why did they have to write anonymously? Recent research has shown they weren't quite as anonymous as all that, and they're closely connected to, for example, the Picatrix, the Ghayat al-Hakim of Muslim al-Qurtubi. He claims to be a member of these Brethren of Purity, these very open and out Pythagoreans, or Neo-Pythagoreans. And of course, the Picatrix being one of the most seminal, not just magical manuals, but seminal texts in the Western tradition, by which I mean Islamic, Jewish, Christian tradition. That is important, right? So between the Brethren of Purity and the Picatrix, the Ghayat al-Hakim, the goal of the sage, you get a significant presence of Pythagoras as a hero philosophy, but also as the prototypical sage mage, right? A saint philosopher who is definitely known for working magic in particular. So this tradition of associating Pythagoras with number cosmology, on the one hand, is very stable into Arabic and then into Persian and other Islamic languages. And also the image of Pythagoras not as a hippie, but as a saint, right? As an ascetic, as a saint. That also carries through quite well. Yeah, the sort of the third, as Earl Fontenelle describes it, the sort of three wheels of Pythagorean tradition in the Hellenistic period. The hippie part doesn't really come through. Pythagoreanism as a lifestyle choice doesn't really come through very strongly. Mm-hmm. People are not going around unwashed. That's not really good in Islamic law anyway, right? You can't pray if you didn't take a bath. So that sort of hippie lifestyle is seen more in the roving Sufi dervish communities, sort of the punk rockers of Islam, but not in philosophical circles, right? We're talking about very orthodox jurists, doctors of Islamic law. They're not going to be flagrantly flouting ritual purity in particular. In fact, they emphasize sort of, in a way, a Pythagorean purity by advocating vegetarianism for the use of magical ritual. You have to observe a vegetarian diet when doing especially astral magic, mm-hmm. right? That seems to be interesting. I don't know if it's an innovation or a sort of a retrieval of a Pythagorean idea. I don't know if they explicitly saw themselves as being vegetarian because Pythagoras.
Right. In the Picatrix, they do it because the Indian sages say to do it.
Yeah, that's another.
They do it because they call it subtle foods, basically.
Right. You want to
raises the subtlety of your own body.
Right. Yeah. You just want to get less gross in the the philosophic sense. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you go back to eating the kebabs all you want after you're done with your ritual. But definitely you want to purify your gross material shell to the extent possible. So it might not be specifically Pythagorean, although we can read it kind of as Pythagorean. And some authors, as we'll talk about Ibn Turka, my guy, he certainly doesn't talk about it as a Pythagorean thing, even though he's a strident Pythagorean. That's the most defining characteristic of his philosophy, of his occult philosophy. And yet he doesn't make a big deal of the vegetarian aspect. So it might be seen as more of an Indian influence, mm-hmm. but one that gels quite nicely with this new Neo-Pythagorean platform that takes shape in the early modern period. I mean, the original Brethren of Purity of 10th century, like I said, quite influential. Their writings also boomed in popularity again in the early modern period, 15th, 16th, 17th century, Iran, Timurid, Safavid Iran, into Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire as well. So there's a number of indexes where you can trace the sort of waves of popularity and marginalization of whatever we want to call Neo-Pythagoreanism or Neo-Pythagoreanisms in the Islamic context. In the medieval period, like I say, it's fairly split between, the opposition between Aristotle and Pythagoras. But of course, in Arabic philosophy, it's kind of Neoplatonic, Aristotelian fused from mm-hmm. its inception. Of any Neoplatonic content, you have, what we associate with Pythagorean content. The monad, the dyad, these are all very important things. The one, the true one. These are all terms that are heavily used in Arabic philosophy, even by people who claim to be pure Aristotelians, like Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina is not anti-Pythagorean. He's just not very pro-Pythagorean either, right? You brought up, the issue of Shi'ism, which is interesting, and Ismaili Shi'ism in particular. So my guys are actually not Shi'i. They often are pigeonholed as Shi'i Sufis or Shi'i mystics, in order to exclude them from the history of science and history of Western philosophy generally. But specifically, they cannot be part of history of science because they are merely Shi'i crazies, right? They're not, part of the mainstream Sunni tradition. They're sort of marginal in some unspecified way, which is it's just nonsense. It's historically just not true. They're firm Sunnis who happen to really love the Shi'i Imams as, the progenitors of occult philosophy and science in Islam, especially Imam Ali and Imam Ja'far Sadiq, the inventors of Lettrism, and we'll talk about Lettrism, basically Arabic Kabbalah, and the inventor of, Arabic alchemy, respectively. So Lettrism and alchemy are quite paired in the Shi'i scholarly context as the preeminent sciences of the Imams, again, as sort of salvific, superhuman figures, mediators between, God and earth, or heaven and earth. As mediators between heaven and earth, their primary, responsibility is to give humankind sciences to deal with, life on earth until the Mahdi, the Messiah, comes and finally brings justice. So my guys are not Shi'i. They are Sunni. They're perfectly comfortable in their orthodoxy. They're serving Sunni Turkish warlords who are establishing these major empires of the early modern era, from the Timurid Empire onward. So basically you have aspersions being cast on my very Sunni Pythagorean occultists in the 15th to the 16th centuries, in order to exclude them from Westernness, from history of science, from history of empire. Right? These are not marginal actors at all. In fact, they're much more prominent, influential in political and social, in their political and social context than any medieval Muslim Pythagorean was, as far as I can tell. They're much more prominent. These people are movers and shakers, as Sunnis, who are also Shi'is, in some generic sense, in that they love the Imams, the Shi'i Imams. They are their enemies in order to, try to get them killed or at least, fired from their, prominent positions as judges, as imperial judges, and so on, chief jurisconsults. The easiest way to get one of your Pythagorean, opponents out of favor is to call them an Ismaili, right? A botany. A botany, I mean, you can, literally, like an occultist, from botan, the occult, or inward, or inner, or secret, as opposed to zahir, the outward, exoteric, manifest. And so basically, calling someone a Ismaili is not a death sentence, but it's really bad for your, for their career. The idea is to tarnish their reputation by even implying that someone an Ismaili is not good for your career. And the thing is, it goes back to one guy who made this connection, Abu Hamid Ghazali, in the 11th, 12th century. He, his big thing in creating a Sunni internationalism, a Sunni orthodoxy under Seljuk Turkish rule, military rule, was to stamp out Ismailism at all costs. And he, as part of this project, totally identified Ismailism with Pythagoreanism. So, you can prove your orthodoxy by calling someone Ismaili, in the post 12th, 13th century. You're basically trying to imply or outwardly, outright calling them a Bothani or a Pythagorean or an Ismaili. They're kind of all part of the same polemical context, exclusively polemical. There's not much usefulness for intellectual historians in this term, although intellectual historians have constantly been misled by Ghazali's great popularity in modern historiography. So we tend to believe him and forget about the actual historical existence of real Pythagoreans, self-identified in the Islamic contexts, including, all of my guys.
So is this why they chose the title of the New Brethren of Purity? Was it part of this fandom of Ismaili science?
Absolutely. So the new brethren, or the original Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan Safa, definitely had plenty of Ismaili components, leanings, but they're not only Ismaili. There's other bits in them. They're, broad. They're very ecumenical,
Right.
and combinatory, and
Syncretists.
synthesizing. Yeah, syncretizing between various strands of Shiism and Sunnism and Sabianism and paganism, like whatever they
Yeah.
take from all tables. Ismailism included, but we don't really know much about the authors apart from even Muslim al-Qurtubi, author of the Ghayat al-Hakim, the Picatrix, in its Latin translation, as you, Dan, well know more than most. Fabulous translation, by the way. I'm using and teaching this semester, and the students are enjoying it.
Awesome.
But yeah, so that parenthesis. But yeah, basically, Muslim al-Qurtubi, he's just some Sunni mathematician, hadith scholar, traditionist, hanging out in Al-Andalus in the 10th century. He's certainly not Ismaili. We don't really know much about him or any of the other authors. By extreme contrast, we know the full biographies of early modern self-styled Neo-Pythagoreans. And again, I think the turning point is really the 14th century and the Black Death, right? The Black Death pandemic changed everything,
Hmm.
right? This is really the pivotal moment, not just for Islamic history, but for Western and Eastern hemispheric history.
Do you want to take a
Uh,
moment to talk about your theory of no Middle Ages, just pre-modern and modern period?
well, it's not really my theory. Thomas Bauer has just written a book, with the exact sentiment in German. It's being translated to English now, I think. So yeah, why were there no Islamic Middle Ages? That's the title of this book, right? So he just comes out and says it, and I'm following that lead. I came to a bit, from a different direction. He's not really focusing so much on history of science or especially occult science. He's more of a literary historian, but you see the same thing happening in Arabic and in Persian prose. This transformation, this encyclopedism, basically the narrative up till now, up till the last decade or two, has been that the post-classical era, obviously a polemical term, is one of conservatism. The encyclopedism that we see is a reaction to decline, or a response to decline, and of course the Black Death. So people were scrambling to save knowledge that was being lost. To the contrary, the Black Death was amazing for science.
Hmm.
It was really, really amazing for science, and the Mongol conquest, right, a century before. And actually, the Black Death was not the first incipience of the plague itself. The Black Death pandemic of 1348 and thereabouts hit the Islamic world extremely hard. Certainly harder than Western Europe. At least 50% of the population dead overnight. Right, that's insane. Less so in like England, I think like maybe 35% of the population, something
Yeah.
like that. But even in England, it's celebrated as the beginning of modernism or into feudalism or something. Like again, this sort of double standard.
Yeah, the beginning of
Black
bargaining power.
bargaining power, capitalism, all that good stuff. So of course, as always, the double standard, colonial racist double standard. Oh, the Black Death did good things, basically a major engine for modernity in far western or northwestern Europe, but only bad things in the Islamic world. Are you kidding me, right? If it did such great things in England, say, then maybe it did even better things in the Islamic world, which is the heartlands of Afro-Eurasia, right? Of course, they're going to be hit the hardest because that's where the center of the world economy was at the time. So everything is flowing through, whether money or texts or textiles, scientific knowledge in general. It's all flowing through there, and then half of the population is knocked out. Um, so you can imagine what happens in that apocalyptic scene. Massive social mobility in which people who were not prominent or would never have been prominent, under the, fairly stable Sunni, societies under Turkish rule, military rule that had been created, suddenly they had a massive new platform. imperial, like a political platform, and they used it and were quite successful in a way none of their Muslim predecessors had been. So that's my, basic theory. The Black Death, as we're saying now, I mean, pandemics are always good for magic, right? Pandemics make magic great again, type of thing, right? So I think we see that, like, I talk about it as an occult scientific revolution that follows in the immediate wake of the Black Death, specifically in Egypt, in Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate or the Mamluk Empire. So that's where all of my guys were sort of trained, in Cairo. It's like, where occult Pythagoreanism was really fermenting at the time. North Africa in general. Again, this has to do with Lettrism, Islamic Kabbalah, which is really a product of the Western Mediterranean zone. So, Kabbalah going, Hebrew Kabbalah going along the northern shore of the Mediterranean, and Arabic Lettrism coming along the southern shore of the Mediterranean until the whole thing is encompassed. The Black Death hits and spreads that very peculiar Andalusian, Maghrebi, Western Mediterranean Kabbalah Lettrism cosmology, which is very strange and peculiar and, pretty Neoplatonic and Neo-Pythagorean, but very Sufi and very, religious, which is why we talk about Jewish Kabbalah, not so much in the history of science, but rather the history of religion. And we don't really talk about Islamic Lettrism at all, in either context. But yeah, again, it spreads to Cairo. Black Death just explodes across the Eastern Islamic world, the Persianate world, and it becomes completely spliced into the DNA of Islamic imperialism from that point forward in a way that just did never happen before. So yeah, that's you need a good pandemic to make magic great again.
Right, and to issue huge social change all at once.
Yeah, exactly. And
I mean, that is something that they've said about this particular pandemic, is that it's accelerated a lot of processes that were happening, and it kind of condensed the amount of time that those processes would take, like businesses going under and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and you have a lot of contemporary observers during the mid 14th century, very Sunni, very Orthodox, Puritan, kind of more puritanical in their approach, who are, happy to, not hunt for witches, but hunt for Ismailis. They're Ismaili hunters rather than witch hunters. The one big difference, of course, no one got burnt to no one was killed for witchcraft in Islam, as far as I can tell. Some people might have lost their jobs by being called an Ismaili. And some, certainly plenty of people received capital punishment in places like Cairo or Damascus, but never for magic, right? It's a really different story. We're not talking about the whole Catholic Protestant, witch hunting, witch craze situation at all.
Right.
The people who were complaining the loudest about magic, quote unquote, the occult sciences, and facilely trying to equate occultism with Ismailism, were unsuccessful. They were totally unsuccessful and forgotten. So in the 14th century is kind of this pivotal point, where you don't get sort of a big, pivotal point in the Latin Christian context, because obviously, we know what happens, there. I mean, you have plenty of occult science going on in elite circles, sure. But they have to be much more apologetic than my guys, right? My guys are not apologetic at all, because they have won the debate, right? They have all the political patronage they could ever want, and you have some more Puritan scholars complaining on the margins about their ascendancy and trying to use the old slurs to get them out of their positions of power, but failed. So in these slurs, they explicitly say, there's a guy Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, died in the mid 14th century. Very a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, the famous Ibn Taymiyyah, who ISIS, or Daesh, loves so much, patron saint of modern Wahhabism, who didn't like much of anything Islamic. But yeah, so it's very telling that these puritanical folks explicitly called their enemies Pythagorean.
Mm-hmm.
So, and associated with them with the first, the original Brethren of Purity. And so my guys took that slur as a badge of honor and turned it around in that way. So they proudly came out of the closet as, card-carrying Pythagoreans, Pythagorees, and Platonists, Aflatonis. So you have these slurs, and they backfired in a big way.
Right. So they sort of just took back the word.
Mm-hmm. Who knows? And in terms of what they actually knew about, real Pythagoreanism, I mean, we don't, no one knows much about real Pythagoreanism, of course.
Sure.
But we're talking about snippets here and there. We're talking about a few sayings, translated into Arabic early on, in sort of aphorisms and so on. They're aware that Pythagoras is the guy that says the universe is mathematical, definitely, and that's probably their most important doctrine that they adopt. They know he's a vegetarian. They know he's an ascetic, basically, a mystic. They know he is, magical in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And they know, about the music connection, big time, right? The music of the spheres. And that's about it. Yeah.
Did they use, in parallel with the West, did they think of botanism as like a foil to sihr? Was it like in the West with Roger Bacon and the Speculum Astronomiae and all of these debates in Paris in the 1260s, you get ideas that somehow there is natural magic and then there is nigromancia, black magic, and that one involves the commerce with demons and the other is purely just the effects of nature. Did they sort of frame things in that term, or were they kind of accepting of all of these different kinds of occultism?
Right. So this is the main reason why I personally, for my early modern Persian material, hesitate ever to use the term esotericism, especially with sort of connections with botanism. Leanna Saif obviously has proposed that we try to rehabilitate this esotericism as botanism or botania for earlier periods, which may work. But I, as an early modernist, find it to be more problematic for my material because it's not really esoteric in any appreciable way. This is another big thing, right? They know about the Pythagorean silence. These people are not silent. These people are movers and shakers. They write a lot. They write beautifully. They are literateurs. And they are very dedicated to de-esotericizing the occult sciences for imperial use, but also to re-engineer society. Seriously, right? They are not esoteric if we think of esotericism as somehow secrecy, right? Religious secrecy or what have you, or holding your cards close. So basically, the biggest transition from so we have botanism as a purely polemical term. Again, no one called themselves a botany. Sometimes you call yourself one of the ahlul batin, people of the interior, of the inward, or people of the spirit or something. But again, it's really with the ascendancy, political and social ascendancy in the post-Black Death and post-Mongol period of my occultists. They're sciences, so I just for convenience sake, I call them occultists. But there's no real substantive, right? They're not botanies. I mean, they define themselves as Pythagoreans, as Muslim Pythagoreans, Sunni Muslim Pythagoreans who are really into Imam Ali, in particular as the inventor of Lettrism, and Lettrism as the ultimate Pythagorean science, right? And Lettrism, of course, is a form, sort of cognate to Kabbalah. The world is a mathematical, linguistic text, right? The world is a scripture, a second scripture to be decoded and recoded magically, right, by the sage mage,
Right.
Pythagorean sage mage, who has purified himself, almost always himself, with vegetarianism and other ritual purification practices. So yeah, I mean, it is a big thing. But because of the polemical, context, they seem to have rescued the term, and they use Baltan all the time, but never as a descriptor for a social descriptor ever. It's purely an epistemological descriptor, and especially to define what their own philosophical platform as the marriage of the Zahir and Batin. The manifest and the occult, aspects to reality, and their main motto being the Quranic verse, God is He is the first and the last, the manifest and the occult. So their central platform is that of the coincidentia positorum.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
That's amazing, because that is actually the starting point of Joachim of Fior's Lettrism as well. Because he says God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And then he takes that literally. He looks at the shape of the letters, Alpha, and he sees that it's a 3-part triangle, but there's, a blunted top, which is the Father, and then it double processes outward into the Son and the Spirit, and those are linked. And then he has the Omicron in this case, and so that's a round ring, and then he uses these for all kinds of metaphysical speculation about the history of the world and how God in his Trinitarian form unfurls throughout history in these letrous combinations, because not only is he the Alpha and the Omega, the Yao, he's the Yahweh, the U, I-E-U-E, and these are obviously related together because they sound the same when you pronounce them aloud. And so that is the true name of God, and that's how he connects the Yao to the Yahweh, and how these fit into his tripartite vision of history. I'm wondering if there are parallels like that in Ibn Turka, where the letter A is sort of the letter from which everything stems. Presumably, it's the Arab equivalent of whatever the letter Aleph is.
Yeah, which is just a straight line. So it is the ultimate primordial. I mean, the ultimate primordial thing is the dot, the nukta, and you just extend the dot to create the line.
Right. So it's like the Yod in Hebrew.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Because that's what they use in their Tetractus with the divine name.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So you get this sort of fundamental building block, and then the Aleph is sort of the first manifestation of the one after the one, and and so on. And then of course you go down through the alphabet. But this is fascinating stuff. And especially I find what is most fascinating, is the fact that it just explodes in the Persian and Latin context simultaneously.
Yeah.
Without communication. Raymond Lull sure has some Arabic, but he's not really getting into Lettrism per se. No one really knows. Latin Christian scholars don't know what they're looking at, and more importantly, Lettrism is unusable, unlike Hebrew Kabbalah, because it's all Quranic. Right? You can't Christianize that.
Well, it gets transferred in Joachim of Fior through what he calls the intellectus spiritualis, the spiritual understanding. And it's the idea that you can see correspondences unfold through Scripture between the Old and the New Testament, and you see all of these numerical cognates that cross. So to be like the two birds sent out by Noah are symbolic of the two Marys who await by the tomb of Jesus, these kinds of connections. And so for them, it's very much the same thing. It's intensely scriptural, but it is wholly focused on the Bible in Latin. And then this becomes a huge polemical battlefield between Christians and Jews, because Christianity's entire identity becomes predicated on this idea of the spiritual intelligence, that Jews lack the ability to see the connections or the correspondences through the scriptures, and so they can't see the Christological prefigurations that lace throughout their text. Yeah, so I think it is very similar, but it is totally like a parallel development.
Yeah, so it's like, it's like a convergence, but then also a pretty, extreme divergence in a yellow wood, in the sense that, well, we know, like, Pico, the father of Christian Kabbalah, why are you inventing Christian Kabbalah? Well, to, prove the Jews wrong. It's a polemic, in the first place, a theological polemic. That is simply irrelevant in the Islamic context. We're talking about an ascendant imperial states who have no insecurity, right, vis-a-vis other, forms of monotheism. They're just not worried about it at all. And so, again, we're coming out of the same far Western Islamicate, Jewish, Islamic and Christian context, in Al-Andalus, in, Islamic Iberia, in Islamic Spain, and the Maghreb or Morocco. That's where this ferment is happening, precisely because it's sort of so, just like it's Hicksville, right? It's so far out from where, all the main imperial stuff was going on. It's great. It's very cosmopolitan, and it's just a little cut off from, say, Baghdad or Damascus or Cairo or, places farther east. And it's only, again, with the Black Death that you get a lot of mixing and matching. And, of course, the Reconquista and so on is, and the Mongol conquest is sort of really, synthesizes at a much larger scale east and west of the Islamic world. Again, in a way that simply does not happen. You don't get a meshing of Byzantium with, Latin Christendom, whatever. That's just divergent. And interestingly enough, it's only Byzantine Christian scholars that actually get interested in the most popular Neo-Pythagorean sciences in, say, Persian, like geomancy. The Latin Christian scholars have no knowledge and no interest of anything after, the 12th century. Right? They just don't care, and they, because of this sort of, I think, inferiority complex, or some sort of unearned sense of superiority. That we have everything we need now, and we're just the best, while not really being in communication with anyone else. Openly creating this fictional narrative whereby the torch is passed from Arabic and so on to Latin, and then Arabic just dies, withers away. The Greeks, Byzantine scholars did not do that, which is very interesting. And as a result, you see much more interest in, especially Persianate forms of occultism. Not so much Lettrism, because again, the whole Christian, you can't really make Lettrism Christian. You need to stick with your Kabbalah in that case. But yeah, again, we're talking about these weird, pretty Neoplatonic, pretty Neo-Pythagorean, but also very, very Sufi and Jewish mystical, movements in the far, far west of the Mediterranean, and spreading all over the place suddenly, and combining in new ways with imperial, policy in the Islamic context, but not in the Christian. So to the point that, again, this motto, he is the first and the last, the beginning, the manifest and the occult, which is interesting. We have to do a lot more research to see exactly what implications that has. The fact that Joachim was only had half of the verse, right? He's the Alpha and Omega. Great, yeah, but what about the the occult and the manifest? God is the occult and the manifest. This provides a huge scriptural valorization for occult science in particular. So again, you don't have witch hunts in the Islamic world. That may be part of the reason. So the polemics, go away, but it's really these weird things that are happening that go west, especially to go east after the Reconquista. That's how obviously Kabbalah is spread to Italy and so on, and further north, and that's eventually, this is my theory at least, you get Sola Scriptura and Hebraica Veritas, and basically Protestantism is one of the repercussions of kicking out all the Muslims and Jews from Islamic Spain.
Yeah, what I call the Latin polemical tradition, rooted in Petrus Alfonsi and Raymond Marti and Paul of Burgos and Jerome of Santa Fe. These are all the authors that Marsilio Ficino and Pico are drawing upon in their polemics.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all conversives for the most part.
Yeah.
So it comes straight out of Andalusia.
But you don't have the converse. I mean, there's no conversives problem because look, everyone's Muslim. I mean, it's fine. It's like the dominant prestige culture. I mean, there's plenty of non-Muslims running around, but they don't need to have Jewish informants. It's all in Arabic. It's from Ibn Arabi and Ahmed al-Buni. These are the two sort of main figures for Lettrism. It goes back to Ali. I mean, it's attributed to Ali, and at the very beginning of Islam. But it's really the vision of Ibn Arabi as an occult philosopher. On the one hand, letter theory,
Mm-hmm.
which he doesn't really talk about Pythagoras at all. I mean, he sees it as his own, kind of like direct, access to
his
reality.
download.
Yeah, his own personal downloading. He says, yeah, other people have done it, but this is all mine. Yeah, he's very, very self-confident as a thinker. He's one of the top 10 most important thinkers in the entire Western tradition. As a consequence, he's just insanely productive writer, but also very, very difficult writer, and again, very esoteric writer in the sense that it's really hard to extract a coherent philosophical system from his writings. Think about him as the James Joyce of of Islam. Very modernist, very confident, very revolutionary, but very difficult to plumb those depths. It's very esoteric by design to protect it from the unworthy, which is actually a fairly Pythagorean trope, right? Of mystification.
Yeah.
Ahmed al-Buni, his contemporary, is more known for practical lettrism, practical Sufi lettrism or letter magic, where he actually makes it a little less astrological. So he's a big departure from, say, the Picatrix.
Yes.
Where magic is natural. It's just we're talking about natural magic, right? It's not scriptural magic, right?
Right.
The universe is not a second Quran.
Yeah, it's the causal to the hermeneutic shift or semiological shift.
Right.
It's a totally different mode of doing science. One is by analogy, and the other one is by chasing down causes.
Well, and arguably, it's more Pythagorean in the loosest possible sense of that term, in that you have to personally, you have to achieve personally spiritual purity to do any science, including astronomy, right? So you get, all sorts of, some astronomers are also Sufis or occultists or what have you. I mean, most astronomers are also astrologers, but it becomes a sort of, a social imperative to be, vegetarian, for example, right, or what have you, to be spiritually pure as well as physically pure to do science, and that's kind of a new thing, and certainly the Picatrix. Obviously, the Latin translations are not very faithful. Translation is not very faithful.
Yes, I can attest to that.
But I mean, the original Arabic is a little bit more spiritual, rather not quite as gross, if that makes sense.
Yeah, less flos naturarum of pseudo Jabir.
Yeah, exactly. So not quite as funky body parts needed for in the cauldron.
Feces magic.
Feces magic, exactly. Kako magic, right? But yeah, so basically it's a shift from just really guts natural philosophy, which is great. I mean, magic continues to be just standard natural philosophy for all of my guys. Absolutely. It's just they're not so concerned with magic per se because it's just not a universal science. It's it's displaced by the ultimate Pythagorean science, Lettrism. The world is a mathematical and linguistic and hence scriptural text that should be analyzed in the first place mathematically, whether you're an astronomer or you're whatever you are, right? Whether you're a state bureaucrat, I mean, you should just be approaching the world in that way, and also organizing society in that way, right? It's a social reprogramming platform as well, which is obviously comes through in sort of the millenarian or apocalypticist movements in the Latin Christian context, and they've been well studied, and Savonarola and all these folks all the same stuff is happening in Islamic context, and some of those movements have been studied, but only as religious movements. They have nothing to do with science, history of science whatsoever, which is again a massive colonial double standard. But the main point I wanted to bring up: what is the consequence to Western intellectual but also political history that Lettrism is purely non-polemical and Kabbalah is a primary battleground for Christian-Jewish polemic?
Well, I mean, it's like the Hebraica Veritas idea that's not present there in the Quran, since everybody reads it in Arabic.
Well, that's the thing. That, as I always tell my students, I mean, Islam is Protestantism, right? It's the original Protestant protesting movement. A bunch of Jews and Christians and other monotheists of the Arabian Peninsula getting together and saying, you know what, I'm sick of the Trinity. This sucks. It doesn't make any sense. And it's a revivalist, Protestant movement. I think there's a drastic simplification, obviously, but I think it's useful to see it in a macro historical sense as people say, Islam needs a Protestant Reformation. Are you kidding me? Islam is the Protestant Reformation, so you don't really need another Protestant Reformation, especially once you have imperial ascendancy and hegemony from Spain to North India and Central Asia. Like, you don't need a Reformation so much as you're not making Islam great again. You're keeping Islam great.
It was an Ottoman-funded psyop, the Protestant Reformation.
Well, that. It is exactly that. Like divide and conquer. Absolutely. This is. It's funny, but it's to some extent it's kind of true in that the Ottomans were hammering away at the fact that they are more Christian than the Christians. So just like hitting them really where it hurts.
And meanwhile, the Christians think it's the end of the world.
Well, to be fair, the Ottomans think the same thing, mainly because they're so Christian, so Mediterranean, or Mediterraneanized anyway. If you can use that term. This is all very reductive, I know, but it's fun to think these ways in this way sometimes. So the Ottomans were obsessed with the end of the world, to no less degree, but they were actually in more of a position to help the world to speed up the end of the world, hence the explosion in Ottoman imperial circles of precisely Lettrism. Lettrism booms there because Lettrism, especially applied form, helps you, allows you to predict every event to the end of history, especially political events, the rise and fall of states, and when Jesus is going to come back. That's what Lettrism allows you to do. Jaf, in this case, letter divination, and this is attributed. The invention of it is attributed to Imam Ali, but perfected by through the Suficization process with Buni in North Africa and then Cairo, to Abdurrahman Bastami, Ibn Turka's Ottoman cognate, who's as Cornel Fleischer's work has shown, his lettrist manual became a Ottoman dynastic handbook that was copied in miniature form that like princes would carry around the palace with them, right? Or put them in their boot when they were traveling on campaign, type of thing. Like, we're talking about Lettrism being totally non-esoteric. We're talking about princes taking lettrist manuals with them on campaign.
Yeah,
right?
It's magic, but it's not esoteric.
Exactly. It's very occult, but not esoteric in the sense of secrecy at all. But Bastami. We can come back to Bastami again. The Ottomans are super into Lettrism, but everyone's super into Lettrism. Different rulers, are more interested than others, certainly. But everyone's using, as Noah Gardner has called it, we need to talk about this shift. And Noah Gardner works primarily on Buni and Bastami. But we're looking at a new cosmological imaginary, right? It is a absolute paradigm shift in the Kuhnian sense. Mm-hmm. Things are different now, and you can see that much more clearly in the Islamic world than in the Christian, Latin Christian world, mainly because they're a little too apocalyptic out there. They're like most of my people are not rah 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 for the end of the world.
Right.
They're actually
Pico and Ficino are definitely riding that current. Like that's what my dissertation is entirely about, is this apocalypticism that's driving their ideologies and how they inherit that from the mendicant orders, and Wakamism is one of the strains that feed into that. But what's fascinating is that they both, in parallel, shift to Lettrism.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, again, the Ottoman, sort of the Ottoman experience. I mean, the Ottoman Empire is a Persian empire, but it's also, a very Byzantine and, Christian empire as well. It's a new Rome. I mean, that's what, that's how they saw themselves.
Yep.
And polemicized against the Habsburgs and stuff, right?
Yeah, they were the Rome, Caesars and the pharaohs and
the whole thing.
Yeah,
exactly.
They were all of it.
They're caliphs, they're imams, they're Caesars, they're pharaohs, they're the new, the second Alexander, they're whatever you want, that's what the Ottoman Emperor is. However, so is the Mughal Emperor, right?
Yep.
He is all of those things and more.
And the Great Khan, yeah.
Yeah, and the direct descendant of Chinggis Khan and so on. So yeah, basically, what is interesting and what is rarely done in the field, because Ottomans get most of the playtime, for good reason, but also bad reason, in the sense that, the closer you get to Europe, the more relevant you get, which is nonsense. And of course, the Ottomans are a European empire. It still doesn't seem to have sunk into the general consciousness that the Ottomans are like half European empire. So why do you keep on saying Ottoman versus Europe? It makes no sense. But insofar as they are a European empire, they're very much caught up in this apocalypticist ethos that is not really evident, in the rest of the Persian world, which is even more, like the Mughal Empire was, much more populous and much wealthier than the Ottoman Empire, but yet it's been studied, a fraction, it's been given a fraction of the mic time when we're talking about early modernity across the Eurasian, Afro-Eurasian ecumene. But yeah, the Mughal Empire is really where we need to look to see exactly what happens when your Lettrism isn't polemical and it's not apocalypticist, right? Which kind of go to the same place. The Ottomans are super into Lettrism, in order to prove that they own Jesus and therefore the end of the world, right? Jesus is, this is, from previous traditions, hadith, Jesus will, descend to wrap things up and hang out with the Mahdi at the end of time to one of the minarets in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. That's just where Jesus is coming back to earth. Therefore, the Ottoman impulse to conquer the Mamluk, another Muslim state, which is totally illegal in Islamic law. You can't conquer another perfectly good Sunni Islamic state. You can't do that. And you certainly can't ally with Christians against Muslims. But
right, they're in the House of Islam.
Yeah, exactly. But they obviously Christians ally with Muslims and, all the time, or Muslim, vice versa, to the point that, the Pope was so hopeful when the Mongols, conquered basically the world, that, and there's plenty of historians among them. He was so hopeful that, finally we can end the world. I forget which Pope. We can finally end the world. We'll convert the Mongols to Christianity, and then we will literally own the world. And then they sort of get, Iranized, they get Persianized and Islamicized, and that.
Yeah, they send William of Rubruck and those John of Mandeville and these guys.
So sad. The world can't end yet because no one owns all of Afro-Eurasia. And of course, forget about the Western Hemisphere. But anyway, we know where all that fun, Colombian, and I live in, a town called, Columbia, South Carolina. So we know exactly where crazy Colombian apocalypticism, gets us.
And that came straight from Joachim of Fiore, actually. Columbus was a Franciscan tertiary, and he was very fond of the prophecies of Joachim of Fiore. Mm-hmm. He thought that that the end times would happen under the reign of a Spanish king, and then Jews would be restored to the Holy Land, and then the end would come. And so
Well,
he saw himself as part of that process. It's in his diaries.
it was, well, I mean, he wasn't wrong. It was the end times, and
Yeah,
that's what
for a
genocide
lot of
is, right?
people. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, this is so, so again, the sort of East-West comparison, but I think a more useful. East-West is just so polemical itself. As I have argued, Islam is just the West. It's actually the greater part of the West if you count, sort of economic activity, scientific activity, population, wealth, in general. It's the default form of Western civ after the fall of Rome. That's just how that works. I mean, it's the primary heir to both Persian imperialism and Roman imperialism. Whereas the Latin Christians only get half of that DNA. But it's fine. It goes off into interesting directions. But the point is, it's still big parts of Western Europe are just Hicksville, and they're not really aware. And that the Renaissance itself, we say, oh, the Renaissance is the beginning of greatness. No, the Renaissance is regressive. I mean that it's the Renaissance, right? We say, oh, that's amazing, and we use
It's
a nice
impulse
Latin
to
term.
conservatism.
It's a conservative. It's a fundy movement. That's just what it is, and it's a purificationist, sometimes puritanical, right? And really
especially with
anti-civil.
Ficino and Pico and Savonarola. Like
Yeah,
it's as clear as day.
Yeah, they're like not burning. We see them as, oh, wonderful philologists. They're saving texts and such. Well, yeah, but they're like, with one hand, and the other hand they're burning all the Arabic stuff, right? Well, they're not burning it, but they're doing their best to write it out of Western history, which they failed to do at the time, but eventually do succeed, because that we keep repeating that as orthodoxy now. That there's no relevance. But if you look at the Byzantine scholars, they don't think Islam is over. They don't think the vigor of his Arabic and Persian scholarship has gone anywhere. If anything, they're even more impressed with the new stuff, right? They're so like geomancy, and these sciences. So basically,
I think that makes sense, though, because the reason why they think that their situation is so dire is because they're dealing with Averroism in the universities and Ottoman encroachment in the East. And so to their world is crumbling apart, while the world in the East, they're doing fine and dandy. So I think it makes sense that there's a kind of an imbalance in apocalypticism.
Right, but then if you go to the Mughal Empire, there's zero apocalypticism, and you have Emperor Akbar himself as a talismanic being, a saint philosopher king, illiterate, like a prophet king, in fact, which is of course not very orthodox thing to say, but hey, like you can, like, anything really does go. I mean, of course, there's a lot of people that grumbled in the Mughal Empire, but the fact remains, like, he's the first to unify this much of the subcontinent. Under this expressly occultist, but especially in a way Pythagorean ideology, where the king has to be, like again, archetypes of Tarentum, right? He's taking that model to a whole new level, where he is basically semi-divine, an avatar of Jesus, or basically the reincarnation of Jesus, but also of Chinggis Khan, who are kind of the same person, right? And Jesus, especially in the Mughal context, Jesus is a great amazing lettrist, but he's also by definition an imperial figure. But he's a very different Jesus from the Ottoman Jesus, right? Very different, because he's a lettrist. How do you learn how to walk on water? Like Jesus, well, here's manuals. Really, Ibn Turka, is one of the first lettrist writers to make that trope of Jesus as a lettrist, and then by extension imperialist, popular. And then that just becomes all the rage, because again, Ibn Turka is a Timurid scholar. Timurids, of course, the long 15th century. And I want to come back to the the major conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter here, because that's again Lettrism as a primary ideological tool. But also astrology. But anyway, the point is, the Mughals, they're just Timurids who got kicked out of Iran by the Safavids, for a bunch of crazy, Sunni Sufis who then converted to Shiism and became militarized and so on and so forth, and had God King. Shah Ismail was a God King and duking it out with the Ottomans over there. But meanwhile, the Mughal, the Indo-Timurids or the Mughals are, just sort of becoming massively wealthy and expanding everywhere as well. So because they had a nice buffer zone in Safavid Iran between the Ottomans and the Mughals, and the Mughals, fell to the British sooner than the Ottomans did, they sort of get the, short shrift, short end of the stick in historiography. But again, until recently, now the new studies have shown the same occult platform is common across the Persian world, but used in very different ways. Some extremely apocalypticist, like the Ottomans. Others anti-apocalypticist, like the Mughals. In fact, Emperor Akbar himself used to hold these late night sessions with representative, priests and scholars of every religious tradition, of which there were many in his expanding empire. And these debates would get pretty virulent sometimes, as you can imagine. But again, he's holding himself up as a superior, like a divine king, prophet king figure, a new Solomon. Mm-hmm. And so he rises above, like the Mongols, following his great granddaddies. Like the Mongols, he transcends all religions on this mere earth, right, as a mirror of infinite heaven. So yeah, basically in these debates, he just calmly said, no. He said the young Earth theory is nonsense, which of course pissed off the some of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars,
who all believe the Earth is 7,000 years old.
Well, or yeah, exactly,
without
or 6,000 or whatever. The point, the young Earth theory is what allows you to be apocalypticist.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. History is 7,000 years long, and you're somewhere in there. So use the scripture to figure it out.
Well, and also, if if you can figure out exactly when the world's going to end, you can win history.
Yes.
You can be the last guy. What is it? The last guy to be king of the hill is king of the hill forever. I guess I don't know. Or like musical chairs or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically, you're basically trying to win history, but it's a very linear approach, which is very, kind of more of a Mediterranean approach to, the shape of history. It's just, the cyclical thing is a bit more, linear, and obviously history, time
they exist together.
They can coexist, not in our historiography. We're all teleological to a fault. But especially in the Mughal or Indo-Timurid context, like you have one of the most powerful and certainly wealthiest rulers of the 16th century in all of Afro-Eurasia saying young Earth theory is nonsense. Get that get this nonsense out of my face. The world is millions of years old, obviously.
Huh.
And how does he prove that? Going to the Sanskrit, going to the Upanishads.
Yeah.
That's a Muslim ruler transcending, everything, and sort of taking the mickey out of any apocalyptic argument that could be made against his political, legitimacy by simply saying, yeah, no, we own Jesus, and they completely adopted Catholic Trinitarian iconography to depict the Mughal, emperors. Because they are the reincarnation of Jesus, but not to end the world, but to create a new, just to start a new dispensation in deep time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't they also, in the Islamic world, and I think maybe Ibn Washia had a hand in this theory or passed it along, that there were like 1,000 atoms. There were many atoms before the atom of the Bible. It's sort of in the same way there are many Hermes Trismegistuses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't remember if that's Ibn Wahshiyah. That sounds very likely, but the thing is, especially for folks who are in sort of American evangelical or North American evangelical environment. My high school or my middle school textbook has Adam riding to work on a brontosaurus, right?
That's
You know,
amazing.
oh yeah, Bob Jones, good old Bob Jones. So it's like pounded into you. And it's also very, very much a part of American imperial ideology that you can win history, which is, again, the same old kind of apocalypticist DNA that you get from the far West, and the Ottomans then participate. But again, you don't get that in the rest of the West, not the West and the rest of the West, because of this divergence in Cairo, with strains going, Ottoman and Timurid strains, Ibn Turka being responsible for the Timurid strain, which then becomes the kind of dominant strain for the rest of the Persianate world or the rest of the West. Not that everyone is familiar with it, but it just becomes part of the background. And again, the new cosmology, the paradigm shift is complete, to the same way we just presume Newtonian physics is still operative at the
Right.
macro, or sort of the daily, in daily life, and we're all just like particles slamming into each other. Although of course Newtonian physics is incorrect, we feel it
Well, it's correct
intuitively.
at that scale.
Well, it's correct. It works at that scale, but clearly, if you
It
go
doesn't run
up,
all the way down.
it
Yeah.
does. It's not like a universal theory, right? And
Right.
of course, Newton as another, a member of this, wonderful, wonderful, crazy, motley
Apocalyptics. Yeah.
Neo-Pythagorean tradition in, the Greater West. But again, he has contemporary Muslims kind of doing the same thing and just as obsessed with the Quran as he's obsessed with the Bible, and thinking about the world in mathematical and scriptural terms always at the same time.
Yeah.
Although less apocalypticist than Newton because he's Christian, they're Muslim. But the divergences, there's divergences and reconvergences. Islam as Protestantism means that you can't really get a new Protestant movement, maybe, and this is reductive, I know, mainly because the main cultural centers, the main cities of scholarship in the early modern period, Cairo then sort of passes the torch to places like Istanbul, but especially Isfahan, Shiraz, Delhi, these places, right? Such that uh, it's the same DNA, but it's a very obvious family resemblance from seriously Delhi to London.
Right.
Very obvious continuities, resemblances, parallelism, especially when it comes to things like Lettrism, but is exactly at those nodes of parallelism that they also diverge the most.
Right.
Weirdly,
And
ironic.
it's the Abrahamic Platonic synthesis that we see, the
Hmm.
red thread keeping all of these things together. And
Or
that's
they,
fundamentally what we call the West, is the descendants of that intellectual heritage.
Right. Yeah, and it's again Islam being at least as much a part of that as Latin Christendom, and of course
Right.
no one remembers the Byzantines. And again, the Byzantines. Speaking of sort of this apocalypticism, you have famously one of the great Neoplatonist revivalists of all time. What's his name?
Genesis
Platon.
Platon.
Platon. Yeah. Who probably hung out with some of my Lettrists in Istanbul.
Right.
Right. And again, so apocalypticism is fine, but like this revivalist moment, right? So this is also what defines early modern Islamic philosophy more generally, and scholarship has shown this, that you have a very strong Neoplatonic turn, right?
Yes.
It's Avicennism, is for Ibn Sina as the second, Aristotle. He certainly saw himself as that and was received as that. And he's not exactly anti-Pythagoras, but he's not pro either. He's not pro occult science,
Yeah.
definitely,
Like Aristotle.
like Aristotle. So the one of the greatest indexes of this sea change, this cosmological shift, this paradigm shift, this new cosmological imaginary, is precisely the people that were anti-occultist, in the philosophical context or the theological context, like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, or Ghazali, the guy who equated Ismailism with Pythagoreanism and occultism. And by the way, then that argument is used to say the reason why the Black Death and the Mongol conquest happened in the first place is because of the rise of Pythagorean occultism.
Is this Ibn Khaldun?
Yeah, Ibn Khaldun, but also the same Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya guy. They were contemporaries, but they explicitly say like it's all your fault, and they sort of they're bad losers type of thing. But yeah, anyway, so you have all these that is there. Plethin, right? So
right. Yes.
this perennialist revivalism or renewed antiquarianism is just as much a feature of Safavid philosophy, which is Shia, but also perfectly Sunni too. I mean, this is the thing. Safavid is a Shia empire, sure. It's a state religion, but it took 100 years to really Shiify it. Iran was where Sunnism really was invented in some respects. It's securely a Sunni society, where, so it took a lot of social reengineering. And of course, guess what? What were some of the main tools whereby the Safavid, Shahs, like Tahmasp, Shiified or Shiized Iran, this Sunni region, a Sunni, famously Sunni place. Occult science, like geomancy, Pythagorean occult science was a really good way. Like, some of them were obsessed with like Shah Tahmasp, he was obsessed with geomancy. He himself was a geomancer and so on. Anyway, the point is, you have this strong turn, both, so Sunni Shia sort of takes up a lot of airtime, but both the Sunnis and the Shias are using the same sciences, right? As especially revived, as an expression of this antiquarian perennialist turn in the early modern period. So what's the best way you can prove yourself to be a perennialist, by say the 16th century?
Taking up the perennial philosophy.
Well, and Pythagoras in particular, and how do you prove that you're Pythagorean? Well, you're a letrist, which obviously it's I'm not so concerned with whether you can Ibn Arabi, who is responsible for much of this, and Ahmed al-Buni, these people are not Pythagorean.
They're Gnostics
themselves.
They're like
right?
idiosyncratic Gnostics.
Well, they're just wacky Andalusians who's, or, sort of North Africans who are kind of doing their own thing in relative, not isolation per se, but, they're kind of doing their own thing. And a lot of this sort of world is scripture discourse is very Andalusian, very Western, far Western. And it begins like already in 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And Ibn Arabi and Buni being the sort of culmination of these processes, and they quote their forebears to this effect. So effectively, you have the Pythagoreanization of Lettrism after the fact in that sense. It's not just like letter speculation, as it was with the earlier Sufis of like the 9th and 10th centuries. It's like a full-blown, fully articulated metaphysics physics, right? By the time you get
mathematics.
Yeah, it's a mathematical, universal science. That's how what Ibn Turka does to it. That's why Ibn Turka is such a seminal figure in the history of Western intellectual and imperial history. Not only does he make Ibn Arabi usable, which imperially and scientifically, he makes Ibn Arabi useful. Useful for both imperial and scientific ends. And he does that by Pythagoreanizing him, if you will, in a way that, you just can't say Ibn Arabi himself was, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, we're talking about intellectual history. Nothing, we're not, you can be as respectful as you want of the ancients, and then do whatever you want with them, right? Which is exactly what defines, early modern, Western intellection generally. I'm just saying, look, it's happening at least as much in the Islamic world as it is in, say, Renaissance Italy or wherever.
Yeah.
And so you have these people like, Copernicus and, Kepler and, Bruno and what have you. You say, oh yeah, it's not problematic to call them Kabbalists and Pythagoreans. Kepler is not really a Kabbalist. But he's certainly a self-identified Pythagorean.
Right, and after Reuchlin, those two things become the same in the West.
Yeah, exactly. So it does converge there, and different people have their own take, but in broad strokes, we have these Brunos and Copernicuses and Keplers in the Islamic context, none of whom they've just been written out of the entire narrative, simply because they're Muslim and they're not Latin. I mean, even the Byzantines were written out, but like simply because they're Muslim. Again, it's just like insane double standard. Muslims can only be religious, they only can be mystical, unless they're philosophical, in which they're probably not really good Muslims. I mean, it's just insane Protestant thinking, right, infecting all of the historiography. So effectively, we need to, study people like Ibn Turka, who is really, the closest cognates. I don't want to be reductive, right? Obviously there's a very different context, but in terms of larger historical impact, we're talking about Ibn Turka as basically a combination of Nicholas Cusanus and John Dee, right? That's how you get this sort of really powerful Neopythagoreanism in there, playing of the occult science, but also the imperial project of Dr. Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth, urging her to conquer the Western Hemisphere North America as a British patrimony.
Camelot.
Camelot, exactly. King Arthur was there, so of course
it's our land.
We touched it once, so great, wonderful. But yeah, I mean, basically, see Ibn Turka in those ways. So coming back, so that's Lettrism. Astrology, the definitive imperial platform that was mixed and matched and adopted by many courts in the early modern period, is this Lettrist astrological dual platform, whereby, for example, you prove that Tamerlane, right, Emir Timur, Commander Iron, he, of course, tried to reconstitute the Mongol Empire and almost succeeded. And this is Timur's main, not patron, but basically Timur slaughtered. Ibn Turka grew up in Isfahan, right, in southwestern Iran, major cultural center. The home of and Shiraz and all that. Sort of were the hotbed of Persian culture and poetry and so on. He was a kid when Timur slaughtered most of the inhabitants of his hometown and carted them all off to Central Asia. As a scholarly family, he spared all scholars and artisans and poets and calligraphers. So he's part of that big shift, a major traumatic shift in his own life. And yet this is the state he is trying to, not salvage, like sanctify, right? He's trying to divinize Timur himself, who slaughtered his, almost everyone in his hometown. So, it's very interesting, it's like a very traumatic experience, needless to say. So the fact that, he was in Samarkand, Timur's capital, and then went down to Cairo to study, and that's where he became a crazy, occult philosopher, lettrist. And then went back to the Timurid, Timurid state, and immediately started his project of trying to create occult philosopher kings out of these crazy Turkish warlords, and succeeded to some extent in completely retiring the old Sunni Seljuk model of Turkish military rule, where the ruler does not have to be particularly good Muslim, much less a philosopher king, right? So basically, he using Lettrism and astrology as this dual sort of platform to divinize these Turkish warlords, and then retroactively, you have to to help do that. He sort of applied the same to Timur himself, as a manifestation. Get this. Of the basically of the Quranic Alif Lam Mim, which is one of the famous opening mysterious isolated letter series. There's 29 surahs of the Quran open with these muqatta'at, these isolated letters that don't spell words. They're They're difficult to decipher, shall we say. But this is the foremost proof that the Quran, this is like the key. This is the cosmic key, right? And I guess we'll talk a bit about cosmic philology, which is my favorite category for all of this. But as a cosmic philological key to the Quran, the isolated letter series, in this case ALM, which is usually associated with political transformations in history. So he says Timur is the avatar or incarnation of that Quranic letter series, which is why he was able to conquer the world effectively, right? So you can only be an imperial figure if you incarnate these isolated letters of the, from the Quran. So you can then understand you have the Quran playing out not just as a mathematical text a template for understanding reality scientifically, but also it's literally the blueprint for political imperial history. Yeah. So if you can identify where you are on that chessboard, and Timur himself invented 2 new kinds of chess. He was a smart guy. But on this political chessboard that is history, if you know what's happening ahead of time, of course you can change the future militarily, and so on. So a lot of war magic is going on. But more importantly, you have to know your place in history, so you know what is possible to you in terms of imperial expansion. That's what he did for the Timurids, and his program of trying to create scientist sultans or philosopher kings, it kind of sort of exemplified in not his first patron Iskandar Sultan, a very, very, very major patron of the arts and sciences, and himself an occultist and a scientist and a mathematician. But unfortunately, he was killed early on by his uncle, his rival, Shah Rukh. So Ibn Turka's first great patron was actually doing exactly what he wanted, and his first patron said Lettrism is the supreme science, period, for science and politics. But he was killed too early on, and then I won't get into all of his patronage attempts. But another one of his would-be patrons, at least, was Uruz Beg, probably the most famous sultan scientist in Islamic history, the founder of the Samarkand Observatory in Samarkand, the preeminent scientific institution in the Western world of the 15th century, early 15th century. The star tables that were produced over 30 years at this Samarkand Observatory were still being used in London in the 18th century, right? It's a watershed in the history of astronomy in particular, in the West, and ever more precise mathematical measurements of the stars, of course, for astrological purposes, right? Mm-hmm. Still historians of science tend to shy away from the fact that you need extremely accurate astronomy to have extremely accurate astrology. Anyway, so Ibn Turka is very much behind this push towards not just mathematizing the cosmos in a Pythagorean sense, mystically or apolitically, or in some sort of woo fashion, but with practical, measurable results on the ground, with major impacts on history of science, as in the construction of an observatory and the successful completion of star tables that then became extremely important for the progress in astronomy for a couple centuries.
Yeah, I think I remember reading some of this in, was it George Saliba?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's got a book on the influences on Copernicus and the astronomy of the early modern period in Europe, and kind of the influences that it borrowed from these kinds of observatories.
Well, this is the thing. I love George. We had beers together. We however sharply disagree when it comes to occult science. He's not particularly pro occult science, and again, it's not just Professor Saliba, but especially recent historians of science They have no. They're not shy about simply cutting out occult science as pseudoscience. It's not like just we do astronomy, we do mathematics, and they have no relation to things like geomancy, astrology, much less Lettrism. Actually,
Right,
I wanted
even
to
though they
talk.
patently do.
Right. So, how do we understand socially what are the social political mechanism for constructing one of the most important scientific institutions of the 15th century, in Samarkand under the Timurids? Well, there's no way to explain it other than, well, it happened, it was important, so let's see what the math says, right?
Yeah.
That's totally legit. But why did suddenly, for the first time in Western history, first time did astronomers sit down and mathematize astronomy by getting rid of Aristotelian physics, right? That's a really major step, a very bold step to take. Of course, they didn't, they weren't impolite or disrespectful of Aristotle. They just quietly said, yeah, we'll just, it doesn't, yeah, we're going to just treat, astronomy in purely mathematical terms and see where it goes. And one of the places it does go is allows you to propose, a rotating Earth, right? Which is of course totally not acceptable in Aristotelian physics.
Yeah.
But so another major step forward, as Saliba and Jamil Ragib and McGill have shown, is another major step forward in history of astronomy and mathematics in particular. And Saliba even calls some of these folks, basically, they're major architects of scientific modernity, even though they've been sort of written out. However, they're all occultists as well, they're Lettrists or geomancers or what have you as well. And that's part of the major motivation for doing it. But also, like, science takes money, right? So you have to change this paradigm. You have to shift that paradigm first before you're going to get your funding for math and astronomy.
And part of occultism is creating value out of thin air by using the discourse of secrecy. You inflate the value of what it is you're hiding. It could be crap that you're hiding, but if you broach it in these esoteric terms or occult terms and are always veiling what it is that you are hiding, you increase the value of that thing, and you're way more likely to get a patron on account of that.
Well, I would have to disagree a little bit. Again, I draw, just for my purposes, I have a pretty sharp distinction between esoteric and occult.
Right.
I use, esoteric, again, this is, in edict terms, rather than emic, but I'm using esotericism more as a sociological descriptor, and occult more as an epistemological descriptor, right, for occult science, a science whereby you extrapolate from visible to non-visible data.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's just, I think that's fair. That's how we can rehabilitate the occult sciences for history of science, where to this day, we still don't have the history, of any of the occult sciences, right, in the Islamic context, because they have been dismissed so, rigorously, consistently as pseudoscience. And of course, Ibn Khaldun, the plemicists are given sole, spotlights, and
that's a firing range.
It's a firing range, but unfortunately, it's a circular firing range. In that, like, we don't know most of the history of science in Islam, right? We know pretty well the history of astronomy, and mathematics is coming along. Medicine, less so. I would say about 90% of history of science, historiography, for the Islamic context, is astronomy and mathematics to some extent, and then like maybe 7% medicine, and everything else, like 3% for everything else, including all the occult sciences, right? Most of which are, again, still, we don't, we have individual studies here and there, astrology especially, but again, usually divorced from astronomy, which is totally anachronistic. But the main, what I want to rescue, I don't want to rescue or rehabilitate. I want to, colonize this narrative, which I agree with, and I think is very important, by simply bringing the occultists back to the table where they certainly belong, Ibn Turka, and so on. But basically, the creation of what Ihsan Fazlolu is called mathematical humanism, And Fazlullah is not averse to the occult sciences, but he specifically says this is, this mathematical humanism has led to the mathematization, the epochal mathematization of astronomy, which is a harbinger of scientific modernity and Newton and all that, is not Pythagorean, because Pythagorean is mystical. Pythagorean means mystical. Now, of course, that is exactly the point where I'm going to have to disagree, respectfully, because all of these people who are extremely influential in their societies and politically at court, and had good patronage, called themselves Pythagoreans, and they certainly did not call themselves Sufis. Like Ibn Turka is they were not esoteric.
Silence.
Yeah, they were not esoteric in any way, shape, or form in that sense. In fact, so they're very proud, Pythagoreans, and they're very emphatic that they are not Sufis. So it's again, this same old slur, right? Oh, they're just Ismailis. Now we say, they're just Sufis. They're just mystics, in order to not have to deal with what is in fact really complicated, really difficult texts. But they're preserved. They're massively preserved in the archival record. Even though even the depredations of the last couple of centuries, colonialism and invasions of various kinds, especially in Iran, where Afghan invasions and the burning of the Safavid imperial libraries, which is a insane disaster, and so on. But basically, there's still so much occult scientific material, textual material available that we could we have a couple centuries of work to do before we can, piece together a better narrative. Again, I mean, it's hard to imagine for a Europeanist scholar or a classicist, but 95% of the texts we have, hundreds of thousands of texts, and even more artifacts. I mean, they've never been studied. Some of them not even cataloged. I mean, we're not in a position. We're certainly nowhere in a position to comment yet on the full history of his science, the history of Pythagoreanism in the West. We're still missing huge chunks of that story, and so instead of just skipping over them neatly and saying Kepler was the last Pythagorean, which has he's been called the last Pythagorean. No, I mean.
No.
If a Muslim calls themselves a Pythagorean, they're a Pythagorean. I think maybe, right? So let's just get rid of this racist colonial double standard that's perverting everything, and let's rescue this. I really like this idea of mathematical humanism, because it is very puts it into really nice conversation with Renaissance humanism, and of course Ibn Turka by that standard is as much a humanist as Pico.
Yeah. If we can even call Pico and Pino humanists.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it's just like forget East-West. It's more Persianate, Latinate, comparison, and also some Byzantine in there as a pivot, and see what emerges. But right now we only know we've only been looking in great detail at one side of the coin. There's a whole other side to that coin.
Right. So another question I wanted to ask is there an ostensible dark side to Pythagoreanism in the East, as there was with figures like Pico and Ficino in their push toward radical universalism?
So let's just put it this way: where would you rather live in the 16th century, Delhi or London?
Oh, I would hate to live in London in the 16th century. That's for sure.
Or Istanbul, right? I mean, you want to live in Istanbul or Delhi or Isfahan, or these are rich, wealthy, cosmopolitan places where you're not going to get burnt at the stake as a heretic, for example. Like, D should have gone to Istanbul. He would have had much more success. Bruno should have definitely picked up and gone to Isfahan. That sort of thing. He would have had much. He would not have been burnt at the stake. There's no way that would have happened, right? It's just these are much more open societies. Think about Islam as the America of religions in the early modern period or something, right? I don't know. That's really insanely reductive, and but it's kind of true in the sense that there was a radical ecumenism that was embraced in a way that's just totally unknown in the Latin Christian context. Ecumenism is certainly the rule of the day, and chauvinism is
it's
certainly
also
the rule.
the goal of Pico and Ficino is radical ecumenism. It's just that it's under their own terms, and it's by it making an equivalency between the Prisca Theologia and contemporary Catholicism as they saw it. So I'm wondering, did guys like Ibn Turka see their particular brand of Islam as the perennial tradition? Like, did they make that equivalency?
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm getting to the dark side. Don't worry. There's always a dark side. I mean, we're talking about some of the most militarily powerful empires of the early modern era. I mean, the most military powerful empires of the early modern era. I mean, you're going to get slaughtered. Get out of their way. You will be assimilated, like the Borg, type of thing. But unlike the Borg, when you're assimilated, the best way to think of it is in letrist terms yet again, right? Just as Pico's Lettrism is invented for polemical purposes in the first place, rather than for scientific purposes, say. Sure, it's his perennialist calling card, fine, but it's anti Jewish. That's just what it is. As we know, Lettrism is absolutely not anti anything. It's actually literally says, like, oh yeah, no, you should read the Bible this, read the Bible this way, read the Quran this way, read the Upanishads this way, right? I mean, it's this letrist sensibility that in the Mughal Empire, for example, allows for court-sponsored translations of Sanskrit, not just literature and poetry, but scripture. And the Upanishads under Daroshuku, the famous saint prince who was assassinated by his brother Aurangzeb. He himself is a Sanskritist, and Persianist, and translating the Upanishads into Persian, not Arabic, as the most complete ancient version of scriptural revelation, of which the Quran is merely a modern epitome.
Huh. So it's like the Corpus Hermeticum with Ficino.
Yeah, kind of.
This guy is doing with the Upanishads.
Right. But
he's finding these Islamic prefigurations in the Upanishads in the same way Ficino is seeing the Trinity in the Poimandres, for example.
But the difference here is that it's not a supersessionist argument, at least in this Mughal context. It's not a supersessionist argument. It's not like an equivalency argument either. It's how Daroshuku, as he was beginning to think about doing this huge project, he has this preface to his translation. I think, what is it called? Sir Asrar.
The Secret of Secrets.
The Secret of Secrets is the translation. Is the Persian title for the translation from not all but many of the Upanishads. In his preface, as a good Timurid prince, I mean, Mughals are all Timurids. As a good Timurid prince, what's the best way you can do to justify your pretty radically ecumenical project of drawing some sort of equivalency, at least in the eyes of the more orthodox, between Hinduism, quote unquote, and Islam from deep antiquity? You use letrist arguments, right? So he brackets his apology for why he's doing it by showing that it's mathematically encoded in history. It's just time to do it. The secret must come out, and it's called the Secret of Secrets. And of course, this is where the tension between occultism and esotericism really comes to the fore. It's the Secret of Secrets, which he's now making sure everyone can read,
right,
in a really nice, accessible Persian, right? So it's totally de-esotericizing in that sense, and he brackets it with the letrist arguments because that's just what you do. It's kind of like a Timurid brand, right? Lettrism and astrology. And I forgot to mention the astrology part. You're a lord of conjunction when your birth or the beginning of your career more or less coincides with one of the great conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter. of course, foretelling political and religious upheavals and transformations on 20-year periods. But then Timur is associated, in particular, he's a Sahib Qiran, the Lord of Conjunction, because his the birth / beginning of career coincides with one of the middle conjunctions of Saturn Jupiter, which moves it from one elemental triplicity to another. In this case, from air, the air triplicity, which ruled the Mongol age, which saw a lot of upheaval. Right, air moves a lot faster and massive communication, and any air technology and science and postal service all massively exploded under the Mongols. Right. Yep. And that's where globalization begins. So it's it was a very air age. Incidentally, 2020 December this year, it's already been a fun year, hasn't it? But it's this is the beginning in December of the new Mongol age, the new air age. We're now doing one of those major shifts into an air era, and this is kind of what it will look like for a while, with multinational corporations as the Mongols or something. Anyway. Yeah. And plenty of more pandemics. And the point is population plagues and population mobility, moving around, refugees, climate refugees, and so on. Anyway, it's a very fitting thing. The last couple times that you had this transition from air to water, a transition into air, like we're doing, the Mongols conquered the world, Rome fell, and Alexander, the Great, conquered the East, right, and created an East-West Rome, Greco-Persian Empire. So that's the last 3 times that happened. So Ibn Turka is aware of that. He's valorizes the Mongols as the initiators of this massive new global reality, really.
So is he using Abu Mashar for the Great Conjunction theory? Yeah.
It's all quite standard, textbook stuff by then. So basically the transition from air to water is defined by the person of Timur. He is born at that conjunction in Scorpio, in 1365, I think it was, that initiates, like the birth of Muhammad, and there's an equivalency drawn here, to kind of hint, wink, wink, maybe Timur is kind of prophetic too. But yeah, basically, Islam is associated with Scorpio and sort of the water cycle as well. It's seen as a Renaissance, like the Renaissance. What we call the Renaissance. It's like, period of flourishing, especially in the arts and sciences and so on. It's sort of putting the pieces together, and seeing what new possibilities are available after a quite chaotic air age. So Timur is inaugurating a Renaissance of Islam, effectively. And that's how you prove that astrologically. So he's a Lord of Conjunction, the Sahib Qiran, and that becomes the dominant Timurid imperial title, Mughal title as well from then on, but also supplying letrist proofs of the same thing. So not only is Timur the Lord of Conjunction, kind of Muhammadan in that way, and a Renaissance of Islam figure, but also he's encoded in the Quran. He's like an avatar of ALM in the Quran. So you put those two together, and then that's kind of the Timurid imperial model, which the Ottomans are contesting. They do the same thing. The other sort of Turkmen polities, the Safavids do contest all this stuff. So yeah, basically it's a lot of
court wizard battles.
Assassination magic definitely happened, and so on. But yeah, exactly. So astrology, Lettrism, as the two preeminent sciences. Alchemy comes in a big way, as well as one of the imamic sciences. I know, not to shift gears radically, but grind gears, but did you want to talk about alchemy a little bit as a new possible site of...
Yeah, we can. I mean, we talked about Picatrix, and that sort of, for al-Qurtubi, astral magic is only one half, right? You have the Rutbat al-Hakim, which is, the rank of the sage, and that's all about alchemy. And it hasn't been translated into Latin, but it was as important, if I'm not mistaken, in the Arabic world as the Hayat al-Hakim was.
Sure. I mean, the thing, I'm not, a specialist in alchemy. You'll need to talk to folks like Nick Harris, works on Mamluk alchemy, and probably the, one of the three most important alchemists in the entire Western tradition. Izzeddin Edemir Jildiki, who has been left totally unstudied, even though we have tons and tons of works and manuscripts preserved from him. Really, really difficult stuff, which is one reason. But I would recommend interviewing Nick Harris on Jildiki, and Tuna Artun on Ottoman alchemy. His book will be coming out shortly on that. But those are the only two people that are really sort of bringing back. There's a few other people.
I think of like Lawrence Principe and guys like that.
Oh no, I mean for the Arabic, right?
Oh,
and of course,
right, yeah.
No one's doing it for Persian. I mean, you have Safavid philosophers like Mir Fendereski who are also Sanskritists and big into yoga, but also big into alchemy and trying to see how like Sanskrit alchemy and like Arabic alchemy can go together, and they don't really go together. Anyway, but there's a lot of mixing and matching happening. But the point is, we have even less of an idea what's going on with alchemy than we do with, say, Lettrism, right? Which is saying a lot, mainly because of a different social. Again, I'm not the specialist. I'm just sort of this is a simplification, but mainly alchemy always had kind of a separate status. I never was fully de-esotericized in that.
Yeah, because it's poisonous.
Well, it's economically dangerous, right? Alchemists are working at the mint, but also being banished or having their ears cut off and stuff for debasing the currency. That's kind of the thing. There's usually just a polite silence around them, or polemics or what have you. It's obviously a very vibrant scholarly tradition, but somehow many of the Muslim alchemists managed to sweep their mark from biographical dictionaries or what have you. They were definitely a more secretive bunch for good reasons, political and economic reasons. But again, very closely attached to the imams, the Shia imams. So it never really lost its prestige as a sort of a scientific ideal either. And of course, the Rutbat al-Hakim is a perfect example. The rank of the sage, not quite as popular as the goal of the sage, but the Brethren of Purity, of course, their classic statement, the end of all philosophy, the whole course of study that we've laid out in these, this encyclopedia, it's an ascending curriculum. What you should then master when you've mastered everything else is, of course, magic, alchemy, astrology, medicine, and what we can translate as astral projection, ilm tajrid, the science of divestment, literally. But yeah, I mean, basically being able to get out of your body at will, right?
Right.
So alchemy, medicine, which are of course closely intertwined, but again, Islamicist historians tend to gingerly separate them, for obvious reasons until recently. But yeah, so when we talking about alchemy, it's a major site not just of Shi science, shall we say, but of sort of earliest forms of Lettrism with the Jabr ibn Hayyan corpus. Jabr ibn Hayyan is legendarily said to be the disciple of the sixth Shi Imam, Jafar Sadiq. And then, there's a whole corpus, most of it's, if he existed, most of it's probably not his work, but that's not really important. It's incredibly important, landmark in Western intellection. And he is like full, sort of a lettrist avant la lettre, if I can say that, whereby his alchemical procedure, alchemy, of course, is a universal, science, like Lettrism would later, be under, with Ibn Turka. So alchemy and Lettrism both having claims to being universal sciences, but alchemy first. So you use lettrist procedures as part of your alchemical operations. Most notably, you have what is called the balance of letters. The Mizan al-Huruf is a very famous thing, whereby you can get at the chemical essence of a thing through its name, right? So that's obviously super lettrist, or it would certainly be recognized as lettrist, and it was later on. But yeah, you have those hints in there, and of course, there are earlier, the main source for Lettrism is not Hebrew or Arabic or whatever. It's Greek. It's Greek
Yep.
arithmology, numerology and all that good stuff. And that's we don't have to get into all the late antique stuff, but it's Hellenistic. It's a Hellenistic patrimony to sort of quote unquote Gnostic movements, Valentinian Gnosticism. That really stepped up this Lettrist game, and it percolated it into Judaism and Islam around the same time. Again, that's at least Stephen Wasserstrom's theory, and I think it's quite plausible. Like around the 8th, 9th century, so at a very early level, it's really in the DNA of Islamic scholarship from the beginning. In Shiism first, and then certainly Sunnism, later, and then just becomes just very widespread. So that's the Jabr corpus. And then the Jildiki corpus, which again only Nick Harris is working on. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. It's even more heavy-duty lettrist, but again, alchemy is the master science, not lettrism, right? So it's very mathematizing. It's very lettrist, but it's many other things besides, right?
Yeah. And they were right in the end that the periodic table of elements and all that stuff, it can be understood through number and weight and measure, and ultimately we came to the scientific paradigm of post-Lavoisian chemistry on account of this numerological approach to chemistry.
Right. Well, and absolutely. I mean, even the first atomic physicists in the early 20th century were worried that they would be branded as alchemists. It's this is basically alchemy.
There's a great book on that. I don't have the title.
Oh, I think it's called Atoms and Alchemy or something. Right?
Yes. Yeah. I read it last year, and it's all about the Renaissance of the alchemical aesthetic, if you will. That the science that you're doing is actually alchemy, because you're now dealing with atomic science as opposed to Newtonian physics or something like that.
Right. Well, which is equally occult, but yeah, right. Exactly. Well,
I wanted to mention in passing, we talked about Newton a while ago. He actually calculated the date for the end of the world from the Book of Daniel, and his calculations yielded 2050, which I find funny because that's when we all start dying off.
2050. Well, yeah, but Pico said it was January 1st, 2000, right?
Yeah.
So,
but there would be 1,000-year, there's supposed to be some sort of indefinite period of world Christianity and peace on earth before that. So
the millennium. Let's just put it this way. I'm kind of with a non-apocalypticist on this one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, we are entering apocalypse. The Black Death was absolutely an apocalypse. Or the so-called discovery of the New World was an apocalypse, and yet here we are. I mean, it's not that the human race has to survive necessarily, but be a little less. If we're a little less apocalyptic, maybe we wouldn't. We would be able to survive crises better. But maybe not. Who knows? Maybe apocalypse is a natural, at least in certain environments, a natural defense mechanism, at least emotionally, if not spiritually, to mass death. It
events. Sure seems like a response to crisis, that conservative impulse.
It's a way of letting off some psychological steam, right? It's this is not sustainable. There has to be an escape hatch somewhere. Yeah, but then then the Mongols conquered the world, and that's your escape hatch. Yeah, or Black Death,
or the end of the world for the people living in it.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't Isaac Newton. I admire you, but I don't think 2050 is gonna do it. Now, 2050 is gonna be interesting, and in many different ways. Maybe by then Jeff Bezos will have shipped us all to Mars, and that will be even more interesting.
That'll be Elon Musk. There'll be some sort of factional split between Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, Earth versus Mars. I could see that.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, again, is Amazon and Tesla, are they the Mongols of the New Age? Probably. Yeah, they certainly cause some upset. Of course, the internet is a classic air elements phenomenon, and so on. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, the other big thing to mention is that it doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, you look at the contrast between the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire, right? One super apocalypticist, the other one not at all. Basically just very comfortable in the middle of the world, right? All paths go through India, and all wealth flows through India, whether by ocean or by land. So like China is the Middle Kingdom and so on. India is definitely, like Mughal India is definitely the Middle Kingdom. Just like, again, the benefit of studying things in more balanced Western intellectual and cultural history in more balanced and fair and non-colonialist and non-racist a fashion. So giving equal weight to the Persianate and to the Latinate, for example, shows more options of how people maybe dealt with crises that we're definitely going to be facing for the rest of our lives and well beyond. Is to see, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We don't have to be apocalypticist about it. There are other perfectly Western ways of going about the end of the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, and again, the Mughals being an excellent example of that. Yeah. In any case, yeah. So and also one other last point, I always like to mention this. Reincarnationism booms, but it's often seen as the infiltration of Islam by Hinduism once once the the Mughal Empire is founded, which is nonsense. This is another major part of course, the Neo-Pythagorean tradition, doctrine of reincarnationism, well known to be associated with Pythagoras in Arabic. Emperor Akbar is definitely reincarnationist. It's like no one is hiding the fact that he's a heretic in that way, and a star worshiper and all these wonderful things.
Yeah, there's also Gilgul in Kabbalah, so it's native to Hebrew as well. The idea that there are multiple cycles of incarnations, and that like a higher soul can even come down and attach itself to a lower soul to try to elevate it.
Which is how they're explaining how, Akbar does one explanation how Akbar can be the avatar, or Akbar and Jesus can be the avatar of the same soul or something, right? Yeah, so it's a very imperially useful doctrine to have as well, especially if you're ruling in India. My main point, though, and again to wrap up this whole Pythagoreanism discussion, is that it's just it's in Plato, right? It's fine, Pythagoras, but it's in Plato, the Timaeus. I mean, you can't get rid of reincarnationism or metempsychosis as a Western doctrine. And insofar as Islam is, certainly Western, reincarnation is an Islamic doctrine for all that it's completely antithetical to biblical and Quranic doctrine, right?
Right. Though Plato says he got it from Egypt.
Right, exactly. So, everyone's sort of playing the shell game. The point is, it's a very interesting philosophical position to have, and explains, many things. And of course, it's now, being studied seriously by parapsychologists today. Like at UVA and places, University of Virginia and places like that. So, it seems to be not going anywhere in the Western cultural context. But my main thing is, it's not that Islam is being infected by some alien influence, a Hindu influence.
Yeah.
It's becoming decadent and less Islamic somehow.
It was always there.
It's just a perfectly valid Western position to have from Plato and Pythagoras onward, and it just so happens that it was useful for ecumenical purposes to draw, to say, yeah, you're a reincarnationist, I'm a reincarnationist as a Muslim. You're one as a Hindu. It's all good. We agree that the history
We're all
is
trapped
long.
in the wheel of hell.
Well, or but there's evolution is possible. Let's all become human and angels and gods and so on.
Yeah.
Let's aspire, and of course you can only aspire in an imperial context, which is this very evolutionary and again reincarnationist discourse that occurs in this Timurid and especially Mughal context. It is about becoming superhuman and raising the general evolutionary level of everyone, right? A rising tide raises all boats type of ethos, which is another element of the ecumenism we could really use right now ourselves to prevent the complete end of the world. But more importantly, it's not that they're saying I'm a Pythagorean, therefore I'm a reincarnationist. It's just an available part of Western DNA that some Muslims picked up on. Most did not. Ibn Turka never pronounces on that issue for obvious reasons. In early Timurid Iran, it's a little bit more pragmatic to come out of the closet. So who knows if he was pro or anti? It doesn't really matter as a Pythagorean. But certainly you have plenty of people coming out of the closet as reincarnationists here and there in the early modern Persianate imperial context, and especially in Lettrism more generally, as one of the major ways whereby philosophers attempted finally to reconcile this, to reconcile Quranic creationism or biblical creationism with, Greek philosophical emanationism, right? Yeah. The eternity of the world, obviously completely incompatible. How do you reconcile creationism with emanationism? Lettrism.
Yeah, or the immanent and the transcendent.
Exactly. So some philosophers did that. So moving to some of the pieces I've published on this, 4 in particular. I'm not done with the book on the subject yet, but 4 studies in particular, I could suggest. The philosopher I was speaking about, Mir Damad, died in the early 17th century, a Safavid imperial philosopher. He was one of the people who tried to use Lettrism to reconcile creationism and emanationism as his primary philosophical project. My article on that subject is called World as Arabic Text, Mir Damad and the Neopythagoreanization of Philosophy in Safavid Iran. I have an article on Ibn Turka that's relevant here, especially in the theme of cosmic philology, of Islamic grammatology. And I guess we can fill in the details in the show notes. Yeah.
Yep. And I can put some links too.
Okay, cool. All this stuff is on my academia page. A third one, Powers of One. That's sort of my macro survey of the Arabic and Persian encyclopedic tradition, classifications of the sciences, which shows a very clear shift in how, especially occult sciences, were classified, right? Between the natural, mathematical, and religious sciences, you see a very clear progression from natural to mathematical, corresponding, and I argue, reflecting this new cosmological imaginary, this major paradigm shift of the Mongol Black Death age, that pivotal moment in Western history. So natural becomes mathematical in order to valorize it as a science.
Yeah.
The mathematical sciences being much more reliable than the natural ones, which are a little bit more squidgy and messy. This progression from natural mathematical is also quite Pythagorean, at least according to the people who are some of the people who are doing it. So that's Powers of One, that article.
Okay.
And finally, my New Brethren of Purity piece. Again, it's not the first time the New Brethren have been discussed, but this is the first time I'm putting them in this larger, macro history of Neopythagoreanism, Western Neopythagoreanism, and arguing for them as a major chapter. Just this one movement, Ibn Turka and his colleagues and friends and associates, with reverberations for centuries after that, not just in philosophy, not just in science, not just in imperial, politics, but also in, of course, war magic, but also visual culture, architectural design, even book culture, the boom in Persian book culture and book painting, in some ways can be attached to this new cosmology. Again, we're living the Newtonian cosmology still for all intents and purposes, which is also pretty Pythagorean. I argue that if we presume a larger Pythagorean or Lettrist consciousness in the early modern Persian context, you don't have to be a philosopher to kind of have a Lettrist sensibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Even if you're not aware of it, but it just becomes part of the backdrop of Persian culture. Certainly in science and philosophy, but also in the arts, and also in the rise of vegetarianism as a magical practice, and also reincarnationism. So that's the New Brethren of Purity, putting into that larger, cultural context. And also, I should probably, for the term cosmic philology, I recently have a piece. Is Islamic occult science. So those 5 pieces are kind of lay out my program of research. There's also How to Rule the World on these occult scientific manuals, including lettrist manuals written for these crazy Turkish warlords by lettrists and geomancers and astrologers in the early modern Persian context. If you want to see the where the scientific rubber meets the political road.
Nice. Well, thank you very much, Matt. That was an amazing discussion. Like, we covered so much ground, and honestly, we covered subjects that are certainly new to me in a lot of ways, and I'm knee deep in this stuff. So presumably it's going to be new to a lot of people out there, and I really thank you for that.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Yeah, and we have obviously a lot more to talk about, but can't wait on your new translations and your monograph.
Yeah, so the new translation for Ficino will be out, well, I don't know, we'll be done by October. We're doing the second run through, harmonizing all our vocab and doing all our footnotes and all the really nitty-gritty stuff, but probably by October, we're working every day, so by October we should be done, and then that'll be out, and that's a huge missing part of Ficino with his anti-Jewish polemics.
Beautiful.
It's 38 chapters worth of it, so.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, I should probably mention as well, I'm also just now, the tenure has come in, I'm going back to, hardcore philology, so I'm about done translating 10 Persian and Arabic treatises on Lettrism by Ibn Turka, coming out with Brill hopefully next year.
Yeah, that looks awesome. Are you involved in the Arabic occultism collection that Liana was discussing?
Yeah, we're co-editors. There's 4 of us co-editing it from our Ashmolean conference back in 2017, and that will be coming out with Brill. That's called Islamicate Occult Sciences in Theory and Practice. 15 lovely chapters combining sort of historians and art historians, various disciplines, material culture included. That will be coming out with Brill this November.
Awesome. All right, well, something to look forward to. And thanks again for coming on, Matt. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you later.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much again.
All right. Peace.
Peace out.